Story 1. The Christmas Day Visitor. When I was a kid, I used to love waking up on Christmas morning and running over to the tree to open up presents. As an adult, though, I find myself more looking forward to spending time with family that I don't see often than finding out what gifts might be awaiting me under the tree. In particular, I look forward to my grandfather's stories. I remember one story he told a few years back about an experience he and his family had when he was a young boy. Back then, in the 1930s and 40s, it was a different world. People opened themselves up in ways that they would never do in today's world. If you were driving down the road and someone needed a ride, you'd pick them up and not think twice about it. As my grandfather's story goes, though, one Christmas evening, after all the presents were unwrapped, he and his family were inside their house, keeping shelter from a terrible ice storm. They lived in the country, far from the hustle of the city. By midday, the world outside was encased in ice, trees transformed into glass sculptures, roads turned into treacherous paths. As he and his family tried to keep warm by the fire, the night deepened, and the ice on the windows thickened, turning them opaque. The wind howled like a banshee, he would say, and the house creaked under the weight of the storm. Late into the night, there was a knock at the door. Peering through a small, clear patch on the glass, my grandfather could see someone standing there. "There's someone out there," he said to his dad. His dad shot a puzzled look at him and said, "Who could be out there in this storm?" His dad went to the front door and creaked it open to find a man standing there freezing and shaking all over. Inviting the man in, the figure stumbled in, collapsing to the floor. The man was middle-aged, and his face red and raw from the cold. He was shivering violently, barely able to speak. My grandfather's mother wrapped the man up in blankets and sat him by the fire. As he thawed, he told us his car had skidded off the road, and he'd been walking for hours, looking for help. His name was Tom, and he seemed grateful, but there was something off about him, something in his eyes that didn't quite match his story of a simple accident. Nevertheless, my grandfather's parents decided to let Tom stay on the couch until the morning. After all, it was Christmas, and there was a stranger in need. My grandfather recounted, as he watched the unsettling way that Tom would glance around the house and the wild look that he had in his eyes. As my grandfather went to bed that night, he couldn't sleep. Hours passed, when in the middle of the night, he began to hear footsteps on the stairs. He got out of bed and crept his way over to his bedroom door. As he peered around the corner, he could see that Tom was halfway up the stairs, moving silently, a strange look on his face. Just then, a low and firm voice reverberated through the stairwell. "Everything all right, Tom?" It was my grandfather's dad. It seemed that my grandfather wasn't the only one that felt something off about Tom. Mumbling something about the bathroom, Tom was led back downstairs and out of sight around the corner. The next morning, Tom was gone. He had slipped back out into the freezing, icy cold and disappeared. 2 days later, a pair of cops showed up at my grandfather's house. They were asking if anyone knew about a car down a ways that had slid off into the ditch. My grandfather's dad recounted the story about Tom and how he had showed up and said that he had car trouble. After some discussion in the living room with the policeman, the truth about Tom was revealed. After approaching the residence of the car's owner, police found a woman inside, dead. She looked like she had been strangled, and her husband was nowhere to be found. As it turns out, the description of the husband matched Tom, except his name wasn't Tom, it was Jack. The revelation about the person that was inside their home turned my grandfather, as well as the rest of his family, pale. In their act of kindness on Christmas Day, they had provided shelter to a man that had just murdered his wife. After 3 years on the run, Tom, or Jack rather, was finally caught and brought to justice 4 states away. The incident became a somber family tale, a poignant reminder of the fragile boundary between trust and caution. My grandfather, even in his later years, would often reflect on that Christmas with a mix of awe and a shudder at what might have been. It was a lesson he passed down to us, to be kind, but to be wise. And every Christmas, as our family gathers, we hold our loved ones a little tighter, grateful for their presence and the safety we share. This story, although chilling, has become a part of our family's history, a testament to the complexity of human nature and the unexpected turns life can take, even on a day as holy as Christmas. Story 2. Christmas Cam Horror. I'll never forget that first Christmas in our new house. It was early December when we moved in, just before the holiday rush, and the excitement of a fresh start was palpable. The neighborhood was decent, the kind of place where kids played outside until it started getting dark. Our landlord seemed relieved to have us, mentioning that the last tenant had been a hassle, not paying rent and such. So we settled in, and I anticipated starting my new job come the new year. Christmas Eve rolled around in a flurry of anticipation. My 2 little girls were at that magical age where Santa Claus was as real as the ground beneath their feet. They were bouncing off the walls, their laughter and excitement filling the house with warmth, despite the chill outside. I remember winking at them and saying, "Santa will be here tonight to drop off presents, so off to bed you go." That's when an idea popped into my head. I had a set of security cameras a coworker had given me as a farewell gift. He had bought them the previous summer, but never got around to setting them up, and eventually decided that he didn't need them. They were simple gadgets, not the latest tech by any means, but they'd snap a picture if they caught movement or sound and send a notification to your phone. I thought it would be fun to set one up and tell the girls that we might catch Santa in action. Of course, we wouldn't actually catch Santa on camera, but nevertheless, I thought it was a fun little thing to do for the girls. I figured I'd tell them later that Santa was just too sneaky to be caught. So, after ushering the girls off to bed and ensuring that they were fast asleep, my wife and I set all the presents out under the tree, and I took some time to set up one of the cameras over the fireplace. Satisfied that we were all set for Christmas morning, my wife and I headed to bed ourselves. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, I remember waking up to what I believed was some noise coming from the living room. I remember looking over at my wife, who was fast asleep, and listening with a purpose for any additional sounds, but there was nothing. Thinking that it was probably all in my head, I rolled over and fell back asleep. Early the following morning, I awoke to find dozens of notifications that were silently delivered from the camera to my phone throughout the night. "Movement detected," one would read, followed immediately by "sound detected," then movement again, followed by sound. My first reaction was to think that one, or maybe even both of the girls awoke during the night and did some peeking around in the living room. But as I made my way into our ensuite, my wife hurried her way back into the bedroom from the living room. "Where are all the presents?" she asked. "What do you mean?" I replied back. "The presents that we put under the tree last night, half of them are gone." I was confused. "What do you mean half of them are gone?" "I mean, half of them are gone." Not quite registering what she was telling me, I followed her back to the living room. Sure enough, about half of the presents that were under the tree were gone. Maybe the girls got into them last night while we were sleeping," I said as I scratched my head, trying to make sense of where they could have gone. Just then, the girls made their way in and squealed with excitement over the sight of the gifts, or what was left of them. "Girls, where are the rest of the presents?" my wife asked as she leaned down to give them good morning kisses. "Are there more?" my oldest asked. I could tell by the look on their faces that they had no clue what we were talking about. Just to make sure, my wife and I made our way into their rooms just to double check, and sure enough, there was nothing. We searched high and low in every nook and cranny, to no avail. The presents had vanished. As I stood back in the living room trying to make sense of what might have happened, I caught sight of the camera I had set up just above the fireplace. Then it hit me. All those notifications on my phone. I made my way back to my bedroom and checked my phone. What I saw next turned my blood to ice. The notifications revealed what looked to be a man in our living room. Dozens of snapshots documented this stranger in our home, making his way around, bending down and gathering up the gifts that my wife and I had left under the tree. The horror of that realization was paralyzing. An intruder had been there, just outside my daughter's rooms while we slept. To think that someone had come into our home while we slept terrified me, and as a father, angered me beyond belief. We called the police and supplied the dozens of pictures that had been sent to my phone, but the intruder did well to conceal his identity. He was covered head to toe in dark clothing, and even wore a ski mask to cover his face and gloves to cover his hands. As the police began to investigate, one glaring detail not revealed in any of the pictures was the fact that there was no sign of forced entry. In fact, the front door was locked. The landlord would later tell us that the locks to the house had never been changed. Ever. It angered me to hear this, and I was angry with myself for not ensuring that it was one of the first things that was done after my family and I moved in. Anyone could have simply just let themselves in. Unfortunately, they never caught the person. The images never provided enough for a clear identification. We changed the locks, but the damage had been done. I couldn't help but be grateful, though, that it was only presents that were taken, and not something, or someone, irreplaceable. We've yet to tell the girls the truth about what happened that Christmas. We will someday when they're older and better able to understand. But for now, they remember that year as the year that Santa was too clever for our camera, not as the year that someone made their way into our home and tried to steal Christmas from us.
Story 3. Are you alone? On Christmas? Last year, I had planned to spend Christmas with my parents. They live a few towns over, about 45 minutes away. But as the day approached, the weather had other plans, threatening to lock me away in my small home on the outskirts of town. There was an important in-person work presentation that awaited me after Christmas, and with the weather worsening, I couldn't risk getting stuck at my parents' house and not being available for the presentation. So there I was, making the tough decision to stay home alone on Christmas Day. I remember calling my parents, their voices a mix of understanding and disappointment, and assuring them that I'd visit after the new year, once my project wrapped up. Alone, I peered out the front window as the snow began to fall, my eyes landing on my old car near the road in my front yard. The for sale sign plastered in the window made me sad. I had a lot of memories in that car. It had been with me since my late teens and helped usher me into adulthood. But nothing lasts forever, I guess, and as the years went by, its reliability began to fade. As I stood there, lost in thought, an old Jeep slowed and then pulled over on the side of the road next to my car. For a minute, it just sat there, but then suddenly, a large man stepped out. He walked around my old car, inspecting it with what seemed like more than just passing interest. It struck me as strange, him being here on Christmas morning, when he should have been at home, unwrapping gifts and making merry. I stayed out of sight, watching as his gaze shifted between the car and my house. Something felt off, though. He seemed to be studying my home too, not just the car. Trying not to think too much into it, though, I left him at it and made my way to the kitchen to fetch a cup of coffee, assuming that if he was really interested, he'd eventually call the number I left on the sign. But that's not what happened. As I was tending to my coffee in the kitchen, a knock at the front door made me jump. For a moment, I didn't do anything. I just stood there in the kitchen trying to figure out why somebody would be door knocking on Christmas morning. Assuming that it was the man by the road that was looking at my car, I figured that if I didn't answer, he'd eventually go away. But as I stood there, the knocks persisted. Finally, I approached the door hesitantly, asking who it was without opening. A man's voice responded, wanting to discuss the car. My instincts screamed at me to be wary, but eventually I cracked open the door anyway. Through the screen door I saw him, a man with a vibe that screamed, creepy. At first he asked about the car, but before I could even answer, he gave me an inquisitive look and shot out another question, one that I'll never forget. "Are you alone?" he asked. "On Christmas?" It seemed to be more of a question of opportunity rather than concern. Having been caught completely off guard, I stumbled over my words. No. My boyfriend is in the other room." I could tell by the look in his eyes that he knew I was lying. Without a second thought, his hand reached for the screen door handle, trying to open it. I thank God to this day that it was locked. I slammed the door, my heart pounding in my chest as he began to bang on it, demanding I come out to talk. "Hey!" he yelled from the other side of the door. "Open up! I just want to talk about the car." It was a lie, and the realization of it terrified me to my core. I backed away, trying to gather my thoughts as the banging on the door and the sound of his yells penetrated into my living room. Suddenly, he stepped over to the front window and pressed his face against the glass. I was in full panic mode, screaming at him to leave, but he persisted, telling me to open the door. In the midst of the chaos, I was able to gather myself, and I remembered something: the handgun my dad had given me for protection when I first moved into this house. "Don't ever reach for it unless you're absolutely certain that you'll need it," I remember him saying to me. "The magazine is full," he said, "but you'll need to chamber a round and then kick off the safety." Remembering the conversation, I ran to the bedroom, grabbed it, and then returned to the living room. The man, who had now returned to the front door, continued to bang away as I yelled out, warning him that I was armed. But he just kept banging and yelling. Finally, I slung open the front door, chambered around, and pointed the gun directly at him, through the screen door, my hands a trembling mess. For a moment, I remember seeing a flicker of fear in his eyes. "Leave now or I will shoot," I yelled out. He hesitated, then backed off and finally hurried back to his Jeep. As I watched him drive away, I did my best to catch his license plate, but with the tears streaming down my face, the plates were a blur. As I called my dad and recounted the terrifying encounter, he urged me to hang up immediately and call the police. They arrived, and as they took my statement, they sent out a few cars to conduct a search for the man. Unfortunately for me, the worsening weather hampered their search and they were unable to locate him. Weeks passed with no word, and the fear that the man would return hung over me like a dark cloud. But by the grace of God, a few weeks later, a call came in from the police. They had someone in custody, a man arrested miles over in another town for following a woman home from a bar and harassing her. He matched the description that I had given the police, and I was able to positively identify him as the same individual that had pounded on my door Christmas morning. The relief was overwhelming. He wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. That Christmas was the most terrifying Christmas I had ever experienced. The encounter had left me shaken to my core, but it also instilled a newfound strength within me. I had faced my fears head-on, and while I hoped to never find myself in such a harrowing situation again, I knew that if it came to it, I could protect myself.